Why am I offline? There we go. Awesome, awesome, possum. Hi everyone. Is anyone actually here? Oh, hi guys. Hopefully this is recording. I'll just do a quick react to this 20-minute video. Looks like it's a lot better actually.
Damascus' emergence from political isolation will have far-reaching consequences that will be felt not only in Arab capitals, but also in Moscow, Tehran or Washington. How does Syria's At the Arab League summit in May, Syria was readmitted to the organization after a 12-year hiatus. Only a few years earlier, rich Arab monarchies had backed the Syrian opposition in its attempt to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad. Now these same leaders are normalizing relations with al-Assad. Damascus' emergence from political isolation will have far-reaching consequences that will be felt not only in Arab capitals, but also in Moscow, Tehran or Washington. How does Syria's escape from regional isolation relate to the issue of Arab strategic independence? Let's find out. Welcome to the 20th Report. Consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the video to aid the algorithm. Bashar al-Assad became president of Syria by accident. His father, Hafez al-Assad, who had ruled Syria since 1970, had no significant political plans for Bashar. In fact, Hafez chose his oldest son, Bassel, as his successor. But when Bassel died in a car accident in 1994, Bashar, then working as an ophthalmologist in a London hospital, had to return to Damascus, where his father began to introduce him to the country's political life. Without Bassel's death, Bashar would probably never have become president of Syria and would have continued to work in Europe. The circumstances under which the young Bashar came to power, as well as his very calm nature, meant that when the Arab Spring protests began to sweep across the Middle East region in late 2010 and early 2011, many observers wrote the young al-Assad off, claiming that he was too weak. He was destined to share the fate of Muammar Gaddafi or Hosni Mubarak, who lost their power, and in the case of Gaddafi, his life as a result of the Arab Spring. Al-Assad's chances of survival seemed increasingly slim as the street protests turned into a fierce civil war, with opposition groups receiving massive financial and material support from abroad. The Americans armed the rebels with anti-tank rocket launchers, the Turks poured tons of equipment and men across the border, and there was a flood of financial support for the rebellion from the Gulf Arab monarchies. To make matters worse,
So here we get a common misconception. Syrian rebels were not heavily funded or supported. Whatever that support was, I invite you to ask Syrians in Dar'a, in Deir ez-Zor, in Hasakeh, how much training and arming they were actually provided, because none of them received any. So wherever that was going, it wasn't into Syrian rebels' hands. And when he mentioned the anti-tank missiles, those were specifically meant to attack ISIS, not the Assad regime. and rebels had to specifically sign on the dotted line saying that they wouldn't use these weapons on Assad and only on ISIS. So he has already just made a huge mistake in trying to, in not like clarifying that the US intervention was specifically for ISIS. And every time Syrian rebels tried to take the fight to Assad, they were held back by foreign powers like USA, even Turkey.
The Kurds declared their obedience to Damascus, and large parts of the country came under the control of Islamic State. To make matters worse, the Kurds declared their obedience to Damascus, and large parts of the country came under the control of Islamic State militants.
Interesting, he says the Kurds declared their obedience to Damascus. That's true, but not all Kurds. The Kurds represented by the PKK. I hope he gets into that, but the PKK is not a Syrian Kurdish organization, it's a Turkish Kurdish organization.
Its downfall seemed only a matter of time, but to the surprise of many, the young al-Assad held onto power. Crucial to al-Assad's success was securing support from two directions, Tehran and Moscow. From the first months of the civil war, Iran sided with al-Assad and began sending weapons. Iranian trainers and Shia fighters from Iraq, Lebanon, and Afghanistan came to Damascus. The balance of power finally tipped in al-Assad's favor in late 2015, when the Russians began their military intervention in Syria. The appearance of Russian air power in Syrian skies was the game changer that allowed al-Assad to retake Aleppo, push the rebels out of Damascus, and reach the waters of the Euphrates. Today, after 12
kind of centering Assad as a victim here, the tide turned in his corner. Yeah, he was always helpless, and he still is helpless. But he's also always been willing to murder every single last Syrian to make sure that he's alive. So it's not about him having turned the tide of the war. It's about the scorched earth carpet bombing that he did on every city to wear them down and make sure that they surrendered. And after cities would be conquered, he would write on the walls, his army would write on the walls, "Kneel or starve," or "Assad, or we burn the country."
years of civil war, President al-Assad's position is secure. Most rebel groups have been crushed, while Islamic State fighters have been driven into the Syrian desert. Al-Assad has survived, but can he be called the winner of the civil war? The answer is not so obvious. Al-Assad does not control the whole country. The remnants of the Syrian rebellion still run Idlib province. Al-Assad cannot use force against them because the Turkish army occupies the border areas of Idlib province. Idlib isn't the only place where Turks are a big problem for Al-Assad. The Turkish army also controls much of northern Syria, including towns such as Afrin, Al-Bab, Jarabulus, and Tal Abjad. The country's northeast, where the Syrian Kurds have established their quasi-state, also remains outside al-Assad's control. All attempts to reach a compromise with them have failed. The Kurds are in a very strong negotiating position because US troops are stationed in the areas they control. The American presence, however, symbolic.
Where do I start? Syrian Kurds did not form a quasi-state there. The Syrian Kurds were driven out of that quasi-state by the PKK. They put up fake tokens of Syrian Kurds, like Mazloum Abdi, who's a former PKK member, to represent us. And we're not represented by Syrian Kurds through the PYD or the PKK. This logo you see here, that represents the PYD, or the AANES administration. And they're actually from a Turkish group that trained in Kandil called the PKK.
Is an effective deterrent to al-Assad, as well as the Turks, from resolving the Kurdish question by force. The US is also a problem for al-Assad in southern Syria, where it controls the Al-Tanf border crossing on the border between Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, blocking the shortest land link between Damascus and Baghdad. The aid from Russia and Iran helped al-Assad to stay in power, and perhaps to stay alive, but it was not cost-free. Damascus became dependent on economic aid from its partners. A whole network of Iranian military bases and training centers for Shia militias was set up in Syria. Damascus also became a central hub for the smuggling of Iranian weapons into Lebanon, providing a pretext for regular Israeli airstrikes on Syria. Meanwhile, the Russian presence in Syria has led to tightened Western sanctions.
That's a good point. I'm glad he put it that way. Iran has been transporting weapons to Lebanon through Syria. It already holds a lot of roots in Iraq. And the closer it gets to Israel, the more of a license Israel has to start targeting Iranian shipments. And that's what you see in the news whenever you see Israel striking. They're not attacking Assad. They could if they wanted to, and sometimes they do as a threat, but they don't attack him himself or his army. Most of the time they're targeting Hezbollah and Iran. So I'm glad he says this.
2020, the so-called Caesar Act came into force, de facto blocking Damascus' ability to receive foreign financial support for the country's reconstruction. The then US Special Envoy for Syria, James Jeffrey, summed up the purpose of US policy as follows, quote, "This isn't Afghanistan. This isn't Vietnam. This isn't a quagmire. My job is to make it a quagmire for the Russians," unquote. The Arab monarchies prominently supported the rebels, hoping for al-Assad's swift demise. Why did they decide after 12 years to normalize relations with Damascus and reinstate Syria as a member of the Arab League? Above all, the Arabs realized that the rebellion they supported would not remove al-Assad from power. This became especially clear after 2015, when the Russians intervened on al-Assad's side. The United Arab...
So far, nothing mentioned of the role that US had in clearing the path for Russia to intervene. So many times when rebels were supposed to get funding and support, they were promises made but not kept. And so they ended up being left hanging a lot of the time. And these Gulf monarchies saw that the US was not going to put pressure on Assad to go. And it was in fact helping Russia to take down ISIS. While Russia would take care of rebels, USA would fight ISIS for them. And this led a clear path for Assad to remain. So even though, I don't know, that quagmire statement, I think I might have heard that once or twice, but I don't give much credibility to statements made like that. Like, those are always very cherry picked, and like Colonel this and Colonel that said this about that, and they always hang on to it for years and years, even though like Andrew Exum, for example, literally said the Assad regime was never in our crosshairs, and the number one priority was Israel's security, and that's why we didn't take down Assad, etc. And also Russian and Assad cooperation meant that, Russian and American cooperation meant that the USA and Russia were constantly communicating in Syria about their plans so that they don't interact with each other.
Emirates was the quickest to adapt to the new reality, and as early as 2018, along with Bahrain, resumed official diplomatic relations with Damascus. The Emirates have become one of the most prominent supporters of Syria's reintegration into Arab League. UAE diplomats have been lobbying on al-Assad's behalf, both in Washington and in Arab capitals. The Emirates warned that Arab inaction on Syria would lead to al-Assad's continued dependence on aid from Tehran, which in turn could strengthen the pro-Iranian bloc across the region. Moreover, Abu Dhabi argued that normalizing relations with al-Assad would help block Turkey's expansionist ambitions, which the Arabs view with great suspicion. Emirati diplomatic efforts were relatively well received in Arab capitals. Still, in the end, al-Assad's plan to return to the Arab community failed, because the Americans opposed it, most notably through the Caesar Act, which allowed sanctions to be imposed on any country providing economic aid to al-Assad's government. As a result, Arab enthusiasm for normalizing relations with al-Assad waned, and the issue...
So far, no mention of Captagon, which was actually why he was admitted into the Arab League. He promised to, basically after flooding every Arab country with illegal drugs called Captagon, which are basically amphetamines. They're called poor man's cocaine. In Arabic, it's Abu Hilala or something like that, because it has a crescent on it. Anyways, after filling a bunch of Arab countries with drugs, he promised to crack down on them, first with Jordan, then with a bunch of, I think, the Gulf countries. And so far, no progress has been made. The drug shipments have continued to flow through to every country, being disguised in grocery shipments and anything that they can hide it in. It's interesting that it's all about blocking Turkey and blocking Iran expansionism. No, it's not, bro. They also wanted, because a lot of Arab countries were dealing with Assad individually, they brought him to the Arab League so that they could deal with him as a group, and that way it would have more bargaining power.
She was not revisited until early 2023. However, the driving force behind this process was not the efforts of Emirati diplomacy, but the wider regional realignment. For some years now, the Arab monarchies, and Saudi Arabia in particular, have been pursuing an increasingly independent foreign policy. Individual Saudi decisions are often mistakenly seen in the context of the global rivalry between the US, Russia, and China. However, Saudi Arabia's actions under the de facto leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman are primarily aimed at strengthening the kingdom's strategic independence. The Saudis are not looking to move closer to China, Russia, or the US, but to strengthen Riyadh's role as an autonomous decision-making center. Saudi policy is not unique in the region. The United Arab Emirates, for example, is pursuing very similar policies, also aimed at strengthening its own strategic independence. The strengthening of Arab strategic self-reliance accelerated especially after 24th of February 2022, when America became involved in supporting Ukraine, and the Middle East became a tertiary theater for Washington. Arabs have lost faith in the effectiveness of US diplomacy. In Arab capitals, US policy towards Iran and its regional partners have been particularly misjudged. Although President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and sanctioned virtually all sectors of the Iranian economy, this did not force Tehran to make any concessions. Hardly any sanctions have been able to reduce Iranian influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or Yemen. In this situation, the Saudis decided to take matters into their own hands. In March 2023, during a meeting in China, the Saudis signed an agreement with the Iranians to normalize relations. A few weeks later, the Emirates, accusing the US of passivity in the face of Iranian attacks.
This is something interesting. He mentions that, often it's viewed, like the conflict in the Middle East is viewed through the lens of Russia, China, or USA, and this is wrong because Saudi is trying to seek a more independent foreign policy or independent, strategic independence policy. The way it achieves that is by moving closer to China and Russia. And so it's great that they want to be independent, but they always need to keep a balance of their influence from each state. And so a lot of the time, okay, sure, they're moving away from the US and that's seen as a good thing, but the way to do that a lot of the time is by depending more and more on Russia and China, who, as far as I know, like their human rights record is not any better than the USA. So it's just an important note to add there. It's not like seeking independence means you'll become independent. Usually that'll mean that you'll maybe at best try to make them compete over your influence, Russia, China, and USA. But usually it means moving closer to one rather than the other.
On merchant ships withdrew from the international coalition that was supposed to guarantee the security of Gulf waters. Syria is yet another example of a crisis that Arab leaders are trying to resolve themselves, even if it meant straining relations with Washington. The atmosphere for a compromise with al-Assad was all the better because the Saudi-Iranian agreement, concluded in China in March, had caused a general relief in the region. In addition, a major earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria in February, killing some 59,000 people, contributed to the process. Coordinating humanitarian aid to Syria allowed Arab countries to reopen communication channels with Damascus. It was in this atmosphere that the Saudi foreign minister flew to Damascus in April for the first time in 12 years and handed al-Assad an official invitation to this year's Arab League.
The earthquake was handled terribly by everybody. The whole world just continued to let Syrians down in incredible ways. Like, they keep discovering new ways to betray a people. So as you know, the earthquake was mostly in Turkey, not in Syria, and most of the damaged areas that were affected in Syria were closer to the border of Turkey. Now, earlier in the video, who do you remember was actually the ones that were bordering Turkey? Syrian rebels, not the Assad government. So the fact that everyone tried to use the earthquake as a reason to drop sanctions on the Assad government, on Damascus, where there was hardly an earthquake felt, and the damage compared to the rest of Syria in the north. So Arab countries, Russia, everyone started using the earthquake as an excuse that sanctions are hurting the ability to recover from the earthquake, when in fact Assad was sanctioning the Syrian rebel territories from being able to access any of the foreign aid that came in. It was just a devastating example of how the world completely let us down again, and by conflating Assad with Syria, we've done so much harm to the Syrian people by making it seem as if the interests of Assad align with the Syrian people when they rarely do.
Summit in the Saudi city of Jeddah. Syria's return to the Arab League is a success not only for al-Assad, but also for Moscow. For years, the Russians have been trying to normalize relations between Syria and the Arab monarchies. Moscow can therefore portray Syria's return to the League as a success achieved thanks in part to Russian diplomacy. This is of particular PR importance at a time when Russia itself is politically isolated due to its invasion of Ukraine. Al-Assad's other ally, Iran, is less enthusiastic about Syria's return to the Arab League. Indeed, the Iranians have been trying to turn Syria into their protectorate since the beginning of the civil war. Although Tehran has gained enormous influence in Syria, its attempt to subjugate Damascus completely has failed. This was due to the cunning of al-Assad himself, who maneuvers smoothly between Moscow and Tehran and thus retains a degree of independence. Now that Syria has returned to the Arab League, it is likely that the Arab monarchies will do all they can to undermine the Iranians' position in Syria further. A complete break between al-Assad and Iran is out of question. Still, the stability of Syrian-Iranian cooperation will undoubtedly be tested, especially as the Iranians have already had doubts about al-Assad's loyalty to Tehran. But Syria's reinstatement as an Arab League member is only the first step on al-Assad's path out of political isolation. It is worth remembering that Syria's return to the Arab League does not even imply an automatic normalization of relations between Syria and all the member states of the association. Qatar, for example, did not block Syria's return to the club, but at the same time announced that it didn't intend to normalize relations with Damascus. Until al-Assad reaches a compromise with the Syrian Kurds and the Turks, his legitimacy to rule the country will continue to be questioned by some countries. The protectiveness with which the Americans have surrendered the Kurds effectively rules out the possibility of settlement with Damascus. Normalizing relations with the Turks appear easier. President Erdogan has already signaled his will settlement with Damascus. Normalizing relations with the Turks appear easier. President Erdogan rules out the possibility of settlement with Damascus. Normalizing relations with the Turks appear easier. President Erdogan has already signaled his willingness to meet with al-Assad in late 2022. But Ankara and Damascus have very different visions of what such normalization should look like. Al-Assad hopes for a complete withdrawal of Turkish troops from Syria. Erdogan, on the
So, that was terribly said. Yeah, no, it doesn't seem like what's more likely is Assad and Erdogan, or Assad and Turkey normalizing before Assad and the PKK. That's hilarious. Like, the PKK literally historically has already relations with Assad, and the only thing stopping them from normalizing is the fact that they are U.S. allied. But as soon as the U.S. withdraws, if that ever happens, but as soon as that happens, and since they've slowly withdrawn a little bit, they've sought more support from Russia and Assad. So they're not shy from it at all. It's Erdogan that's under pressure not to, because he has a whole area of anti-Assad rebels, and it's like the biggest area in Syria, where the biggest population in Syria. So, yeah, it's just, I don't know how many Syrians this guy talked to before making this video, but there is nothing stopping from the Kurds, which is the SDF or PKK, to ally with Assad, which they've already done under multiple circumstances. Whereas every time Assad and Turkey get into negotiations about potential normalization, it's always the same thing. Assad requests, Turkey withdraws everything, and they'll never do that.
the other hand, wants to rid Turkey of some 3.5 million Syrian refugees and create a buffer zone on the border that would separate Turkey from Syrian Kurdish settlements. Still, the biggest obstacle for al-Assad remains US sanctions and the aforementioned Caesar Act, which Donald Trump signed into law in 2019. This was a landmark act, as previously the Americans had mainly imposed sanctions on Damascus individually, targeting al-Assad and his closest associates. Instead, the Caesar Act required the US Treasury Department to impose sanctions on any entity providing significant financial, material, or technological support not only to the Syrian government, but also to military trainers, mercenaries, and fighters operating in Syria on behalf of Russia and Iran. Significantly, on the basis of the Caesar Act, the US administration has also developed a special strategy to block the participation of foreign actors in the reconstruction of the country from war damage in areas controlled by al-Assad, the Russians, or the Iranians. In practice, Caesar's law means that the wealthy Gulf monarchies, such as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, although interested in financing the reconstruction of Syria, seeing it as an opportunity to reduce Iranian influence, will not be able to do so. If the Arabs help financially to prop up Syria, they themselves will be subject to US sanctions. It is reasonable to assume that the Arabs, through a web of shady connections, will probably find a way around some of the sanctions, and limited financial aid will flow to Damascus. However, such transfers will be difficult and are likely to remain a drop in the ocean of Syrian needs. Indeed, the World Bank estimates that rebuilding Syria will cost between $250 billion and $1 trillion. In theory, the Caesar Act is a temporary law that will expire in 2025. But as soon as al-Assad was invited to the Arab League summit, a so-called anti-normalization bill appeared in the US Congress. It would extend the Caesar Act until 2032 and tighten sanctions against Damascus. In addition, the bill would require the US State Department to develop a special strategy.
This is stuff that Syrians have lobbied for, by the way. It's not just that this came out of nowhere from Congress. Syrians who witnessed the Arab normalization going on went to Congress and sought this policy
to prevent other countries from further normalizing relations with al-Assad, thus ensuring Syria's continued isolation on the international stage. Nevertheless, Syria's return to the Arab League is of essential importance. It is a clear signal from the Arab community that it can accept al-Assad as Syria's president and of resetting relations with him, even if it means a scratch in US-Arab relations. But this is only the first step towards ending Damascus' political isolation. The existence of US sanctions means that the benefits al-Assad can derive from returning to the Arab League will be very limited. The disagreement between America and its Arab allies over Syria is a good illustration of the broader problem of Arab strategic independence. Syria is an ideal starting point for discussing the US position in the Middle East. Arab leaders see US policy towards the region as less and less effective and are trying to solve Middle Eastern problems independently. Syria is not an exception, but a certain regularity. Despite American objections, the Arabs continue cooperating with Russia in OPEC+. The Emirates are helping the Russians circumvent Western sanctions, and the Saudis are normalizing relations with Iran, symbolically signing an agreement in China. The problem of Arab strategic independence stems from the high ambitions of the new generation of Arab leaders, as well as from America's diminished activity in the region, which has replaced the Middle East with rivalry with Russia in Europe and with China in the Pacific. The assertive policy of the Arabs is often misunderstood by Western commentators who try to assert the next moves of the Saudis or Emiratis in the context of the global competition for influence between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. As a result, there are often alarmist warnings in the West about the imminent collapse of the US-Arab alliance. But the truth is less sensational. The Arabs value America's military support. No other country in the region, be it China or Russia, can replace the Americans as the protector of Arab countries and the guardian of freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. The Arabs do not want to break the alliance with America. Still, they are increasingly calling for a revision of the principles on which it is based, which ultimately undermines the US position in the region. The truth is that American policy towards the region is going through a period of deep crisis. Washington itself is largely to blame. For years, the Americans have not proposed a coherent formula for cooperation between the countries of the Middle East. Indeed, in Trump's time, the idea of an Arab NATO, a confrontational policy towards Iran, and the so-called Abraham Accords to end the Arab-Israeli conflict have come to the fore. Yet the Trump proposal for the Middle East was short-lived. When Joe Biden took over the White House, US policy towards the region also changed. The new administration tried to withdraw from the confrontation with Iran. Still, negotiations to return to the 2015 nuclear deal failed, and the region fell off Washington's list of priorities. The Middle East is now a third-tier theater for Biden, with Europe and the Pacific higher up the hierarchy. As long as the Americans do not offer the Arabs a new, coherent formula for cooperation, the Arabs will develop, quote, strategic independence, create their own foreign policy, and try to redefine their alliance with the US. This, in turn, will be a source of constant, recurring tension between Arab capitals and Washington, as exemplified by Bashar al-Assad's re-emergence in the Arab diplomatic chessboard.
Okay. So not a bad video overall. As you saw, like with the comments I made, there were mostly things that if he had just talked to a Syrian, he would have gotten a lot better. Like, I think I'm going to react sometime to Geography Now's video about Syria, where it's clear, you know, there was a lot of Syrians that he talked to. So, thanks for joining the live, guys. I appreciate all two of you. I think this didn't go so bad, and the recording will be on Twitch, so I'm gonna see if I can upload that to YouTube, and we'll see. Thanks, guys. Bye for now.